Hi, I'm Ray from the Radio Workshop, where I repair and restore vintage valve radios from the 1940s. My amateur radio call sign is Golf 4 November Sierra Juliet. Welcome to yet another podcast. I had my first AM CB rig, which was illegal of course, and I believe it was either 1970 or 1969. This is before AM rigs came to the UK. Where did I get it? It was a crystal-controlled American CB radio. I bought it from a friend of mine. I think it had about 12 or 15 channels, I can't remember. It was quite a big thing. It was transistor, not valve, and it worked pretty well, but of course there was no one to talk to. There were just no other people on 27 megs at that time. The earlier American radios were valve, and from what I understand, they used to run quite a bit of power and have some pretty good aerials. They had the mobiles, of course, but the base stations, they'd have huge aerials with these valve CB radios. So that they must have been pretty large pieces of equipment as well. So, they really did get out and cover some good distances with them. Going back further, being a radio amateur, I had radio amateur gear that actually covered 27 megs, sideband, AM, FM even. So what I had done in the past was tune around 27 megs. This is during the 60s. And on the odd occasion, I'd hear, on a very rare occasion, I'd hear Americans on their CB radios. And sometimes Italians and Spanish. They were all there, but very few of them. Of course, in the UK, absolutely nothing. Going back to the American radio I had, I used to leave it on. There was a channel I found was fairly busy when there was a bit of a lift on, a bit of an opening on 11 metres. I'd hear some foreign stations. I used to just leave it on that channel. Of course, it was quiet most of the time, but every now and then when there was a bit of a lift on, all sorts of things would happen. Stations from all around the world, more or less, would come up. I had a pretty good aerial, of course. I made a dipole, so it was no good just sticking a bit of wire in the back of the radio. So, with the dipole outside at a reasonable height, there weren't all the CB aerials around as there are today, so you had to make your own. And I did hear stations from all over the place. The CB terminology is skip, isn't it? Skip distance. When the skip is long or when the skip is good, that's when you hear things from far afield. Of course, it wasn't known as the CB band. 11 metres, 27 megs wasn't known as CB. It was purely 27 megs. It was American CB. But here it was just nothing. It was just another band, another frequency. Something very interesting happened one day. I had the radio on and I heard this English voice come through, loud and clear, good signal, saying, "Hello, anyone there? Anyone hear me?" So I rushed into the room, grabbed the mic and said, "Who's that? I can hear you. Who's that?" And he said, "Who's that? I can hear you." So we sort of established contact and we both realised that we were in the same town. I said, "Where did you get the radio?" And he said he bought it locally from someone, which I had done. It was the same radio that I had. So someone was selling these. I don't know where they got them from, probably imported them or whatever. And they were selling them. We made contact. We arranged to meet outside a pub in town. And we became friends. We chatted on our old American radios for a long time. And it was great fun. I think that was possibly, I don't know, but that could have possibly been the first proper CB contact on 27 megs in the UK using proper CB radios. I think I was about 12 or 13 when I wrote to, who did I write to? Was it the Postmaster General or the Home Office or someone? And I said, will the UK ever have citizens ban radio? And I actually got a reply. I remember the typewritten letter. I wish I'd kept it. I mean, I'm going back decades, obviously. And they said something about, can't see any reason or any need for citizens ban radio in the UK. I should have kept that letter. That's a shame. Of course, after some years went by, illegal AM rigs started to come into the country. I don't know where from. I remember seeing adverts in places, was it like the Exchange and Mart? This is obviously pre-internet days. CB radios or whatever they were, two-way radios, illegal to use in the UK without a license or something like that. So you could buy it, but you weren't allowed to use it, which was a bit daft. But I think it covered the sellers. They couldn't be done for, I don't know, aiding and abetting illegal transmissions or something, because the advert stated that you weren't allowed to use it in the UK. So these AM rigs did start to come in. I'm not quite sure when I got my first proper, when I say proper AM rig, non-American AM rig. Was it made in Japan or wherever they were made? China, Taiwan, Korea, all these places used to knock out these things. And of course they started to flood the country, and tuning around then on 27 megs, well, in fact, between 25 and 28 megs, 28 to 30 is the amateur band, basically 25 to 28 megs was and still is all CB. I mean, there's no CB now, not as we knew it back in the early days of when FM was legalised. It was full of music, kids, people mucking about, as well as the serious CBers on there, all crammed into these 40 channels. So tuning around as the AM rigs came into the country, you could hear all sorts of stuff, especially when there was a lift on. You'd hear stations up in Scotland, Ireland, from around Europe. It was really interesting. Things started to take off. And of course, it was illegal. This was the main problem, but I think that's what made it so exciting for most people. I remember as a kid seeing films or programs on the telly, American films where they got kids with walkie-talkies and CB radios, and I used to think then, oh, this is fantastic, And of course, Australian programs as well had CB radios, and of course their school kids. Of course, anyone Australian listening can correct me on this, but because it kind of spread out in such a big country, I believe they had, I know they had radios. I think they were on CB frequencies, weren't they? Were they on 27 megs, or was it some other frequency? So the teacher and all the pupils would all have these radios, all at their own homes. So, I remember thinking that must be fantastic. You don't have to go to school. You just go into your bedroom or wherever and turn the radio on. And I suppose, I don't know, but I suppose the kids could chat to each other after school on the radio. It must have been fantastic. Of course, once AM rigs started to flood the UK, anyone and everyone had them. I remember listening in the AM days. There were kids on there. There were adults, mainly adults. I think in the early days, because kids didn't know what they were. I suppose they didn't know how to set them up, or aerials weren't available, so I don't know. It was mainly adults in the beginning. I suppose as more and more rigs flooded the country, then everyone started to get them, the kids as well, the school kids. I met a girl on AM in the very early days. I'd been sitting in this pub, and she had driven past in her car talking on the radio, and it came over the pub audio system. It was just a jukebox back then, with extension speakers, and of course the AM signal, it just was breaking into the jukebox amplifier, getting detected and coming out on the speakers as an ordinary clear signal, ordinary speech. So whenever she drove past this pub and she was on the radio, people could hear her. And I actually, from home one evening, I heard her on the radio and I told her about this. We began chatting on AM CB, and we eventually met up, and I knew her for quite a few months. But that was quite funny, because breaking through on audio like that, I heard stories about like a church service on a Sunday. The vicar's up the top, we are gathered here, and then 10-4, good buddy, this coming over the church speakers. Also setting off burglar alarms. I remember people driving downtown at night on AM, and it set off the shop burglar alarms. There's bells ringing everywhere. The authorities couldn't do a great deal about it because there were so many radios in circulation. There were just more and more and more. It seemed every week that I listened on the various AM channels, there were just more and more people. And of course, as time went by, well, it was just impossible for them. They couldn't prosecute everyone. When FM first came along, I remember the AM lads all saying, oh, that's rubbish, we don't want FM. This was the main problem that the AM lads had with FM. The FM channels were on something away from the rest of the world. So there was America, Australia, Spain, all this lot were on AM channels. And I think FM as well. our channels were then moved away. I think they were moved higher, up nearer to the 10-metre amateur band, 28 megs. So you couldn't hear the Europeans anymore, or the Americans when conditions were good. And it was a totally separate thing, and that's the main thing that people had against it. Of course, it eventually took over, as things do. You know, if you keep selling these FM rigs, everywhere had them. Local shops had to be. Wherever you went, you could buy CB radios, and they weren't expensive. Aerials were becoming available, so it ended up that everyone went to FM. Of course, then we had 80. That was 40 channels. We then had 80 channels FM. That moved people down to. It's the European, isn't it? The lower 80. Well, there were lows. There were lows, mids, highs, high, and all this business. I forget the terminology now. So then there were AM and FM people. In a way, it made it worse because it just used up more of the spectrum. And of course, then radios with single sideband SSB started flooding the market. Now, they were quite expensive, but then you could talk to the Europeans. You could get a decent aerial up, and you could start actually working what they called DX. Now, for this sort of working, people were putting up really decent aerials. I think the rules was it Ofcom or whoever said, you're not allowed to have aerials above a certain height, they must be a certain type, blah, blah, blah. There's all these rules and regulations that everyone just blatantly ignored, and they did their own aerials. They had burners. You probably heard of burners. They're basically linear amplifiers, power amplifiers. You plug your 4-watt CB radio into the burner, and you can get 100 watts out or more. So 100 watts with a decent aerial, and you're covering Europe, no problem. And when there's a lift on, you're covering the world. So fantastic. And of course, the authorities, they couldn't just go around everyone checking everything. There was a time, wasn't there? You had to buy a license. Of course, no one bothered with that, or very few. And then I think a few people did. Then there was no license at all. The whole thing, I think, looking back, in fact, I thought at the time as well, it was so badly handled in the UK. The whole CB thing was so badly handled and organised, setting up FM channels. I mean, the reason they wanted FM instead of AM was because FM doesn't cause so much interference. For example, on the jukebox, FM won't break through like that. AM does, but FM won't. That's why they wanted FM. There was some sort of reasoning behind what they did, but basically it was chaotic. The whole thing was chaotic. And it is now, to this day. There's 27.555 megs upper sideband. That is worldwide. It's a bit like 6.6 megs Echo Charlie on HF. Well, I suppose 27 megs is HF, isn't it? But 27555 single sideband is worldwide, and there's always people on there. I often have a listen there myself. There are always people there chatting and calling CQ, DX. It's just a worldwide thing now. I don't think anything can ever be done about legalising the whole thing and putting it all together properly, because there are too many hundreds of thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of radios and aerials, and they're all on the air. You can't change that. It's too late. There's no point in closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. As I said, it is worldwide, and it's still going strong today. There's nothing much on the ordinary FM channels in the UK. There's a few people, a few diehards that chat to each other. I go on there now and then, chat to one or two people that aren't radio amateurs. I chat mainly on the amateur bands, but there are a few people I know that aren't licensed amateurs, so I chat to them on CB. I've got it on in the workshop most of the time. If someone gives me a shout or I hear someone on there, I'll say hello, how you doing? Sometimes on the European channels you get the Italians and the Spaniards coming through, and of course that is a good indication that the band is opening up. So 10 metres, the 10 metre amateur band could be opening up. What I then do is turn on the amateur radio gear. These days, serious CBers or free banders, whatever they are, they buy amateur radio gear. They don't use any CB gear. They'll spend hundreds of pounds and buy decent amateur radio gear. That way you've got, most amateur radio HF transceivers are 100 watts. They're AM, FM, sideband, CW. Yes, I've heard Morse code. I've heard Morse code contacts going on 27 megs. And I don't know about recently, but a few years ago, slow scan TV on 27 megs. It's like another amateur band with all the different modes, but it's illegal on 27 megs. So I don't know what the future holds there. Talking about the whole thing being a disaster, a mess. There was, I'm sure I'm right, a CB band somewhere around 900 megs, 900 megahertz, somewhere up there. I didn't ever have any equipment for that, but I heard of people that did. There was hardly anyone on there. I mean, who on earth came up with that idea? Ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. Only the UK could do that sort of thing. Balmy. Of course, radio amateurs like myself suddenly had aerials available that covered sort of, 25 to 30 megs. All these CB aerials, you only had to adjust the length to get the SWR right. You could use it on the 10 metre amateur band, and I even use one today on the 12 metre amateur band, which is just below 25 megs, 24.950 whatever. So these aerials really did help the radio amateurs rather than having to make your own, and they were fairly cheap. You could buy one of these CB things and they're fantastic. I've worked Australia, America, I've worked all over the world using a CB aerial on the 10 metre amateur band. Oh, I must just tell you, I pulled up outside a pub once when I had the aerial on the car, and I heard some chap saying, "Oh, look, there's one of those damn CBers." And I could see he had aerials on the car. He was obviously a radio amateur. So I went over to him and I said, yes, I am a damn CBer. I said, I'm also a licensed radio amateur. That shut him up. Oh, well, sorry. What are you doing on CB anyway then? And I said, well, why not? It's another frequency, a band of frequencies we can use legally. Why not? There was this, unfortunately, this them and us thing, the amateurs and the CBers. I don't know why it was like that. I never had that sort of attitude. As far as I was concerned, we were all on the radio and it was great fun. I made many new friends on CB as well as amateur radio. I suppose one thing the radio amateurs weren't too happy with is to get a license, a Class A full license to go on the shortwave bands. You had to pass a fairly tough technical exam and then take a Morse code exam at a Coast Guard station somewhere, pass at 12 words a minute to get on there. And all these CBers did was go and buy a radio and they're on the air. I think and they didn't like being confused with CBers because they'd gone through a lot of time and effort to get their license. But as I say, I never looked at it that way. It didn't bother me at all. Going back to when FM came out and that was legal, I remember thinking as the years passed it was getting quieter and quieter. The kids were losing interest. They probably went on to other things. And in the end, the only people left were sensible. They weren't swearing. They weren't playing music. It was a sensible thing. And it was quite a community thing in some areas. I remember in our area we had various people on CB and they were in touch with each other, elderly people, so they could stay in touch with each other. Just pick up the mic and say hello, if you needed someone. It was really good. And also if you tune around when there's a bit of a lift on, when there's a bit of an opening, you can hear churches, especially in Ireland, churches doing their service over CB radio. And the idea of that is for people that can't get to the church if they're ill or for whatever reason, they listen on CB, which again is terrific. It's such a community thing, which is really good. There we are. That's my recollections of CB. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed listening to the podcast. Look out for the next one. I don't know what it's going to be yet, but I'm sure people will come up with ideas. Do one about this or do one about that. So I shall see you next time. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye for now.